On New Year's Eve, while the mountain town slept behind locked doors and warm lights, a lone biker rode into a storm no one else dared to face. Jack Miller, 43, scarred by work, silence, and years he never talks about, should have kept going. The road was ice. The wind was merciless. One wrong stop could have ended everything. But then his headlights caught something moving in the snow. A German shepherd, frozen, shielding two dying puppies with her own body. Jack took off his jacket, the only warmth he had, and made a choice that would change all of their lives. Because that night, the man who had survived everything was about to be saved by the very dog he tried to rescue. Silver Ridge was the kind of mountain town most people only noticed when the weather turned bad enough to make the news. Nestled between dark pine forests and narrow, winding highways, it spent much of the year wrapped in silence, broken only by wind moving through trees and the occasional rumble of engines climbing the grade. On New Year's Eve, the town felt even smaller. Storefronts along Main Street glowed weakly under strings of tired holiday lights. Snow piled against doorframes and street signs, and the air carried that sharp, metallic cold that burned the lungs if you breathed too deeply. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, and the storm rolling in from the north showed no interest in mercy. Snow fell sideways now, driven hard by wind that cut through layers like a blade through cloth. The mountain road leading out of town was already half buried, tire tracks filling in almost as quickly as they were made. Most people had the sense to stay inside. Fireplaces were lit, glasses were raised, televisions counted down the final hours of the year. Out here, though, there were no cheers, no music, only the sound of wind and the low, steady growl of an old engine pushing forward. Jack Miller rode alone. His Harley-Davidson was an older model, long past its prime, the black paint dulled by years of weather and neglect. Chrome showed through scratches along the tank, and the exhaust rattled slightly when he downshifted, a familiar sound that felt more like breathing than noise. Jack sat heavy on the seat, broad shoulders hunched against the cold, gloved hands steady on the bars. He wore a black leather biker jacket, worn thin at the elbows and torn lightly along one sleeve where it had caught on a nail years back. The jacket had seen more winters than most people in town. Beneath it, layers of work clothes did their best against the cold. Heavy boots rested on the pegs, caked with slush. Jack was 43, though the mirror would have guessed older. His build was thick and powerful, the kind earned through labor rather than training rooms. Tattoos crept out from beneath his sleeves, faded ink telling stories he no longer bothered to explain. His beard was dense and untrimmed, streaked with gray that caught the light of passing reflectors. His head was shaved close, save for a short tail of hair tied at the back, dark and stiff with ice. His face was set in its usual expression, calm, stern, unreadable, not angry, just distant. The face of a man who had learned that reacting too quickly cost more than it saved. He wasn't headed anywhere in particular. He never was on nights like this. Riding was easier than sitting still, easier than listening to the walls of his rented room creak and settle, easier than watching the clock inch toward another year that felt no different from the last. The road gave him something simple to focus on: throttle, brake, curve, repeat. A gust of wind shoved the bike sideways as Jack approached a familiar bend about 3 miles outside town. He leaned into it instinctively, boots steady, eyes narrowed behind a scratched visor. This stretch of road had taken more than one careless driver over the years. Guardrails were bent and scarred, half buried in snow. A yellow warning sign leaned crookedly, its paint peeled and dull. Then something dark moved at the edge of his headlight beam. Jack eased off the throttle. At first, he thought it was debris, another fallen branch or a drift shaped wrong by the wind. The storm distorted everything. Depth vanished. Shapes lied, but the dark mass shifted again, low to the ground, and something about the movement didn't fit the landscape. He braked. The Harley fishtailed slightly on the ice, tires whining as they fought for grip. Jack corrected without panic, bringing the bike to a stop just short of the bend. Wind battered him immediately, snow pelting his visor and jacket. He killed the engine. Silence rushed in, loud and absolute. He swung a leg over the bike and stood, boots crunching into fresh powder. The cold bit at his exposed neck. He stepped forward, squinting into the storm. There, half buried against the snowbank, was a dog. A large one, German shepherd, or close enough. Black and brown fur matted with ice, chest heaving shallowly. She lay curled tight around 2 smaller shapes pressed into her belly. Puppies, tiny. One barely moved at all. The other twitched weakly, a sound escaping it that might have been a whimper or might have been nothing more than breath. Jack felt something tighten in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. "No," he muttered, the word lost immediately to the wind. He took a step closer. The dog's head lifted at once. Her eyes locked onto him, amber, wide, alert, despite the exhaustion dragging at her body. She didn't bark, didn't growl. She simply shifted her weight, positioning herself between Jack and the puppies, muscles trembling beneath frozen fur. Jack crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible. Snow soaked through his knees instantly. He could feel the cold seeping in, numbing, insistent. He didn't rush it. Rushing was how you got bitten, how you made things worse. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog watched him closely. One ear stood upright, the other drooped slightly, stiff with ice. Her breath came in short bursts, fogging the air. Jack glanced at the puppies again. One of them was frighteningly still. He swallowed. He knew this road, knew what the storm would do in the next hour. If he walked away now, there wouldn't be a second chance. He also knew what stopping meant. Exposure, risk, no backup, no help coming. For a moment, he stayed frozen there, balanced between sense and something older, heavier. Then he unzipped his jacket. The cold slammed into his chest like a punch. Jack didn't flinch. He shrugged the jacket off his shoulders and held it out slowly, letting the dog see it. Snow clung to the worn leather. The jacket was thick, lined, still warm from his body. "I've got to take one," he said quietly, as if the dog could understand. "Just one, or they're not going to make it." He reached toward the puppy closest to him. The dog moved instantly, not forward, not back. She lunged just enough to catch the sleeve of his jacket in her teeth, holding it tight. Not a bite meant to tear flesh. A warning, a plea. Jack stopped. They stayed like that for several seconds. Man kneeling in the snow, jacket half wrapped around a dying puppy. Dog holding on to the leather like it was the last thing tethering her to control. Snow filled the space between them. The wind howled around the bend. Jack met her gaze. "I know," he said softly. "I know you don't trust me." The dog's grip didn't loosen. Jack shifted his weight and did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled the jacket completely free and laid it on the snow, open, in front of her. He backed his hands away, exposed his chest to the storm. "I'm not taking anything unless you let me." The dog hesitated. Her teeth loosened on the leather. She lowered her head slightly, eyes never leaving Jack's face. That was all the permission he was going to get. Jack moved carefully, sliding one hand beneath the smallest puppy. It weighed almost nothing, too little. He wrapped it immediately in the lining of the jacket, pressing it gently against his chest, using his own body heat to shield it from the wind. The puppy made a faint sound, barely audible. Jack exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. He reached for the second puppy. The dog shifted but didn't stop him this time. When Jack lifted it, her body sagged, exhaustion finally winning a small battle. "Shepherd," he murmured, more to himself than her. "You're tough." He stood slowly, jacket clutched to his chest, puppies bundled inside. The cold hit him hard now, his work shirt, offering little protection. His teeth clenched once, then steadied. He looked back at the dog. "Come on," he said. "You too." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't. Then, with visible effort, she pushed herself to her feet. One paw slipped. She caught herself, trembling. Snow filled the hollow where she'd been lying. She took one step toward him. Jack turned toward the Harley, already calculating distance, time, and whether the engine would start again in this cold. Behind him, the dog followed, slow and limping, but moving. The storm closed in around them, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Some roads, Jack knew, never waited for anyone. Tonight, he had chosen to stand in one anyway. The Harley did not start on the first try. Jack thumbed the ignition again, jaw tight, shoulders hunched against the wind. The engine coughed once, a dry, hollow sound, then went silent. Snow gathered quickly on the tank and handlebars, settling into the scratches and seams like it had always belonged there. The storm showed no interest in patience. It pressed closer, thicker, louder, wrapping the road in white until the world felt reduced to a narrow circle of visibility around Jack's headlight. He stood there for a moment, puppies bundled inside his jacket, their faint warmth barely noticeable against the cold, already biting into his chest. He could feel his heartbeat now, slower than he liked, heavier. He shifted his stance, planting his boots more firmly in the snow, and glanced back. The German shepherd stood several feet behind him, sides heaving, her dark coat crusted with ice. She held herself upright through will alone. One hind leg shook when she tried to put weight on it, and she compensated without complaint, shifting her balance so the pain showed as little as possible. Her eyes stayed on Jack, tracking every movement. "All right," Jack said quietly. "We're doing this the hard way." He didn't try the ignition again. He knew better. Old engines had their limits, and cold like this didn't forgive stubbornness. Instead, he turned the handlebars straight, disengaged the lock, and began to push. The Harley was heavy on a good day. Tonight, it felt like it weighed twice as much. Snow packed under the tires, resisting every inch forward. Jack leaned his shoulder into the seat, muscles in his back and arms straining under layers of frozen clothing. The puppies shifted inside his jacket, one letting out a weak sound that felt like a thread pulling him onward. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than them. "I've got you." The road sloped upward here, just enough to make each step count. Wind tore at him from the side, slipping through the gap where his jacket should have been. Cold air burned across his chest and throat, making each breath sharp. He focused on rhythm. Push, step, breathe, don't rush. Behind him, the dog followed. She moved slowly, carefully, leaving uneven prints in the snow. Every few steps she stopped, lowering her head, gathering herself. Jack didn't look back too often. He knew that if he did, he might stop entirely. Instead, he kept talking, his voice low and steady, words spilling out without much thought behind them. "Almost there," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. "Just keep moving." The town lights were gone now, swallowed by the storm and the bend in the road. There was nothing ahead but darkness and trees and the long stretch of highway that led to Jack's rented garage on the outskirts of Silver Ridge. 2 miles, give or take. In this weather, it might as well have been 10. Halfway up the grade, Jack felt the first real warning signs. His fingers burned, inside his gloves, then dulled, the sensation fading unevenly. His breath fogged thick and fast, chest tightening more with effort than cold. He stopped for a moment, resting his weight against the bike, and shifted the puppies slightly, pressing them closer to his skin. The smallest one moved again, just barely, but it was enough. "That's it," Jack whispered. "Stay with me." He pushed on. By the time the road began to slope downward again, Jack's legs shook with each step. Snow had worked its way into his boots, melting slightly from body heat before freezing again. His beard was stiff with ice, breath catching in it with every exhale. He focused on the sound of his boots and the scrape of the Harley's tires, grounding himself in something real. When he finally reached the narrow gravel drive that led to the garage, relief came sharp and sudden, almost painful. The building sat back from the road, a low structure of weathered wood and corrugated metal. A single exterior, light hung above the door, flickering weakly through the storm. Jack had wired it himself months ago, a temporary fix that had become permanent by neglect. He guided the Harley under the small overhang and let it rest on its stand. For a second, he stayed bent over, hands braced on his knees, breathing hard. The puppies were still warm against him. That mattered. He turned and looked for the dog. She stood at the edge of the drive, head low, body trembling. Snow clung to her muzzle and eyelashes. She looked older up close, her movements slower, more deliberate than they had first appeared on the road. "Come on," Jack said gently. "You're safe here." She hesitated, then crossed the distance, each step careful. When she reached the door, she stopped again, eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Jack didn't rush her. He opened the door and stepped inside, letting warm air spill out into the night. Warm was generous. The garage wasn't heated properly, but compared to the storm, outside, it might as well have been a sanctuary. The space was small and cluttered, a concrete floor stained with oil and rust. Shelves lined one wall, stacked with tools, old parts, and coffee cans filled with bolts and screws. A narrow cot sat against the far wall, covered in a thin blanket. In the corner stood a small cast-iron stove, blackened with use, its fire long gone but embers still glowing faintly. Jack moved quickly now. He kicked the door shut, locking out the wind, and set the puppies down on the cot, still wrapped in his jacket. He grabbed a stack of old shop rags and layered them beneath and over the bundle, creating a nest. The dog followed him inside, stopping just short of the cot. She lowered herself to the floor with a quiet huff, collapsing more than sitting. Her sides rose and fell unevenly. She licked once at her chest, then rested her head on the concrete, eyes never leaving her puppies. Jack crouched beside her. Up close, he could see how bad it was. Her fur was soaked through, ice clinging to the undercoat. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her sides when she breathed. There was a small cut on one foreleg, already crusted over, and her paw pads looked cracked and raw from the cold. "You've been out there a while," Jack said softly. "Too long." He stood and crossed to the stove, feeding it split logs from a crate nearby. The wood caught slowly, reluctant. But after a few minutes the flame steadied, sending a thin wash of heat into the room. Jack stripped off his gloves, rubbing his hands together hard to bring feeling back, then used them to pull the cot closer to the stove without jostling the puppies. The smallest one let out a faint cry as the air warmed. Jack felt his shoulders ease just a fraction. He turned his attention back to the dog. He filled a shallow bowl with water, warming it slightly before setting it near her muzzle. She sniffed it but didn't drink. "All right," Jack said. "One thing at a time." He found an old blanket in a crate and draped it gently over her back, careful not to startle her. She flinched once, then settled, exhaustion outweighing fear. Jack sat back on his heels, studying her face. Strong lines, intelligent eyes dulled by fatigue. One ear still drooped, stiff with frost. "Shepherd," he murmured again. "Figures." He leaned against the workbench and let himself breathe. His chest still burned, the cold slow to release its grip. He flexed his fingers, sensation returning in uneven pulses. The storm hammered the metal roof above them, a steady, relentless sound. For a long time, no one moved. Then the lights flickered. Jack's head snapped up just as the single bulb above the workbench went dark. The hum of electricity died with it, leaving the garage lit only by the orange glow of the stove. "Of course," Jack muttered. Power outages weren't unusual up here, especially in weather like this. Still, the timing felt cruel. He checked the breaker out of habit, even though he knew it wouldn't help. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the door. He returned to the cot, kneeling beside the puppies. One was breathing shallowly but steadily now. The other stirred, tiny paws flexing weakly. Jack pressed his palm gently against them, sharing warmth, grounding himself in the simple truth of their presence. "You're not done yet," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Behind him, the dog shifted. She tried to stand, failed, then tried again. Jack was at her side instantly, steadying her shoulders. "Easy," he said. "You don't have to prove anything." She sank back down, head lifting just enough to check the puppies before resting again. Her breath was hot now, too hot. Jack frowned. He laid the back of his hand against her neck. The heat there was wrong. Not the good warmth of shelter, but something deeper, heavier. "That's not good," he said softly. He stood and moved to the shelf where he kept a small first aid kit. It wasn't much. Bandages, antiseptic, a thermometer he hadn't used in years. He took it down and worked carefully, speaking calmly as he did. "All right, just checking." She tolerated it, barely reacting, too tired to protest. The reading made his stomach tighten. "You've got a fever?" he said. "Yeah, that explains a lot." He looked around the garage, weighing options. The nearest veterinary clinic was in the next town over, nearly 40 minutes away on a good day. Tonight, with the storm and the power outages, it might as well have been across the state. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, fingers catching in his beard. He felt the weight of the night pressing in, the familiar sense of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for this. That thought came unbidden, sharp and immediate. He pushed it aside just as quickly. He returned to the dog and knelt, lowering his voice. "Listen," he said, though he knew she didn't understand the words. "I don't know how bad this is yet, but you're not alone anymore. I promise you that." Her eyes met his. Something passed there, subtle but real. Not trust exactly, not yet, but recognition. Outside, somewhere far down the mountain, a distant boom echoed faintly through the storm. Fireworks. Someone, somewhere, counting down the last minutes of the year. Jack glanced at his watch, 11:58. He looked back at the 3 lives huddled in his garage, at the stove fighting the cold, at the snow piling higher against the door. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sounds about right." The clock ticked forward, the storm pressed on. And in a forgotten corner of Silver Ridge, as the year drew to a close, Jack Miller stayed exactly where he was, guarding a fragile warmth against a world that didn't care whether it survived or not. The light did not come back. Jack stood in the middle of the garage, waiting longer than he needed to, eyes fixed on the dead bulb above the workbench, as if it might change its mind. Outside, the wind slammed into the building with renewed force, rattling the metal panels and pushing snow against the door until it sounded like something alive trying to get in. The stove crackled, flames licking at the wood, throwing shadows across the walls that shifted and stretched with every gust. He exhaled slowly and turned away from the breaker box. No use pretending. The power was gone for the night, maybe longer. It happened every winter up here. Lines came down under ice. Transformers failed. Crews took hours to reach the mountain roads, if they could reach them at all. Jack crossed back to the cot and knelt beside it. The puppies lay bundled in his jacket and rags, pressed together like they were made to fit that way. One of them stirred when he adjusted the fabric, letting out a thin sound that barely reached the air. The other remained still, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven motions. "Still here," Jack said quietly. "Good." He slid his fingers under the rags, careful and deliberate, checking their warmth. They were warmer than they had been on the road, but not by much. He adjusted the nest again, drawing it closer to the stove, and fed another log into the fire. Sparks jumped, briefly bright, then settled. Behind him, the dog shifted. Jack turned at once. She had pushed herself into a half-sitting position, her head lifted, ears angled forward despite the fatigue weighing her down. Her breathing was heavier now, faster, her sides moving in shallow, uneven rhythms. When Jack stepped closer, she tried to stand again, legs trembling under her. "Hey," he said, reaching her before she could fall. He placed a steady hand against her chest and shoulder, guiding her back down. "It's all right. You don't need to move." She resisted for a second, then gave in, lowering herself carefully. Her head stayed up, eyes locked on the cot. "They're right here," Jack assured her. "I'm not letting them go anywhere." Her gaze flicked to his face, then back to the puppies. Only then did she let her head rest on the floor again. Jack crouched beside her and pressed the back of his hand gently against her neck once more. The heat there had grown stronger, more insistent. He frowned, jaw tightening. Fever was one thing. This felt like it was climbing. He stood and paced the narrow length of the garage, boots scraping softly against concrete. His breath fogged the air in front of him, though the stove had taken some of the edge off the cold. He rubbed his hands together, then dragged them over his face, feeling the rough scrape of beard against skin. "Think," he muttered. The first aid kit offered nothing more than he had already tried. Water, warmth, rest. He didn't have antibiotics. He didn't have anything that could bring a fever down safely. The clock on his phone glowed faintly when he checked it. No signal, no bars. The storm had swallowed that too. He looked back at the dog. She had gone still again, eyes half-lidded now, breath rasping softly in her chest. Every instinct in Jack told him the same thing. Waiting it out was a gamble he couldn't afford. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if arguing against the idea of leaving. Snow slid down the metal roof in heavy sheets, thudding against the ground. Somewhere far off, another distant boom rolled through the air, fireworks, muffled by miles of mountain and weather. Midnight was close. Jack walked to the door and pressed his hand against it, feeling the cold bleed through the metal. He imagined the road again, buried and slick, the way the storm erased landmarks and turned every mile into guesswork. He imagined leaving the garage empty of heat, imagined coming back to find... He stopped that thought. He turned back toward the cot, toward the stove, toward the 3 lives that had somehow become his responsibility in the space of a few hours. "All right," he said aloud, voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "We're doing this one step at a time." He moved with purpose now. He filled another bowl with water, warming it carefully near the stove until it steamed faintly, then set it beside the dog's muzzle again. This time, when he nudged it closer, she lapped at it weakly, tongue slow and uncoordinated. "That's it," Jack murmured. "Good girl." He didn't know why the words came out that way. He hadn't owned a dog since he was a kid. The phrase just fit. He wet a rag and laid it gently across her shoulders, then another along her belly, careful not to shock her with cold. She flinched at first, then settled, breathing evening out just a fraction. Jack sat back on the floor, legs stretched out, back against the workbench. He stayed close enough to touch her if she needed it, close enough to reach the puppies if they stirred. The garage felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls had leaned in while he wasn't looking. Minutes passed, then more. The stove burned steadily, its warmth fighting the cold inch by inch. Jack fed it when it needed wood, careful not to let the fire die. His fingers ached with cold whenever he moved too far from it. He flexed them often, keeping the blood moving. At 11:59, his phone buzzed once, a delayed notification finally pushing through. A simple message from the town's emergency alert system. Severe weather, stay indoors, avoid travel unless absolutely necessary. Jack snorted softly. Yeah, he said to no one. That's the plan? Midnight came quietly, no countdown, no cheers, just the steady ticking of his watch and the sound of wind and fire. Somewhere beyond the storm, people hugged and toasted and promised themselves better habits and brighter days. In the garage, Jack leaned his head back against the bench and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle. When he opened them again, the dog was watching him. Her eyes were clearer than they had been an hour ago, more focused. She shifted slightly, inching closer until her shoulder brushed his knee. The contact was tentative, brief, but deliberate. Jack froze, then relaxed. All right, he said quietly. I get it. He rested his hand against her side, feeling the heat beneath the fur, the steady, if strained rhythm of her breathing. She didn't pull away. Another hour passed, maybe two. Time blurred, stretched thin by exhaustion and vigilance. Jack checked the puppies often, counting breaths, adjusting rags, whispering nonsense reassurances that felt as much for him as for them. Then the dog tried to stand again. This time, she made it halfway up before her legs buckled. Jack caught her easily, guiding her back down. She let out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, something in between. Frustration, maybe, or warning. Hey, Jack said, firmer now. You need to rest. She shook her head weakly, as if arguing, and lifted her muzzle toward the door. Her ears twitched, listening past the walls, past the storm. Jack followed her gaze. The wind roared outside, relentless, but beneath it he thought he heard something else. A distant engine, or maybe his imagination, strained by fatigue. She tried to rise again. Jack's heart kicked harder this time. What is it? He asked softly. What do you hear? She didn't answer, of course. She simply gathered herself and with visible effort got her feet under her. She swayed, then steadied, and took one step toward the door. No, Jack said, standing quickly. That's not happening. He blocked her path gently, placing his hands on her shoulders. She didn't snap or bark. She just looked up at him, eyes bright despite the fever, and held his gaze. Something about that look unsettled him. He glanced at the puppies. They slept fitfully, but they were alive. Warm enough for now. He looked back at the dog, then at the door again. The decision settled in his chest with the same familiar weight he'd carried on other nights, in other places. The kind that didn't ask permission. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. He helped her back down onto the floor, tucking the blanket around her more securely. Then he crossed to the shelves and grabbed his parka, shrugging into it over his work shirt. He pulled on his gloves and scarf, movements efficient despite the stiffness in his fingers. He knelt beside her again. I'm not leaving you alone, he said. I'm stepping out, just long enough to see if there's anyone close by. A house, a radio, something. I'll be back before the fire burns low. Her eyes tracked his face, then flicked to the door, then back again. She let out a soft breath and lowered her head. Jack stood, hesitated, then reached out and rested his hand briefly against her neck. The contact felt heavier than it should have, more significant. Stay, he said. That's an order. He didn't know why he phrased it that way. Old habits, maybe. She didn't bristle at it. She simply watched him as he moved away. He checked the stove one last time, adding wood, adjusting the damper so it would burn slow and steady. He adjusted the nest around the puppies again, committing their shapes to memory. Then he crossed to the door. The wind hit him like a wall when he opened it. Snow blew in immediately, swirling around his boots and legs. The cold felt sharper than before, biting through the layers he'd added. Jack pulled the door shut behind him, locking it, and stood under the overhang for a second, orienting himself. The garage light was dead, the world reduced to shades of white and gray under the storm. He took one step into the snow, then another, boots sinking deep. The road was barely visible now, the tracks he'd made earlier already half filled. He turned back once, looking at the dark outline of the garage, the faint glow of firelight leaking through a crack in the wall. Hold on, he said, though no one could hear him. I'm coming back. Then he turned into the storm and walked. The storm swallowed Jack almost immediately. Snow drove sideways across the road, stinging his face where the scarf didn't quite reach. Each step sank deep, boots crunching through layers that shifted and gave way beneath him. The wind pushed hard against his chest, forcing him to lean forward just to keep moving. The world narrowed to what his eyes could catch in the brief moments when the snow thinned. Dark trees, pale drifts, the faint suggestion of a road that no longer looked like one. He kept his head down and his pace steady. Jack had learned long ago that panic wasted energy. Out here, energy was everything. He focused on small goals, 10 steps, then 10 more. Reach the next fence post, reach the bend where the road dipped toward the creek, keep moving. Behind him, the garage disappeared into the storm. Ahead, there was nothing but uncertainty. The cold worked its way in slowly, creeping through his gloves and into his fingers, his toes. He flexed them as he walked, keeping blood moving, forcing his body to stay present. His breath came out in thick bursts, fogging the air before being torn apart by the wind. He tasted metal at the back of his throat and ignored it. He passed the spot where the road dropped slightly toward the ravine, the same place he'd nearly lost control earlier that night. The guardrail was buried now, only the top edge visible under a heavy cap of snow. Jack paused for half a second, scanning the darkness beyond it, then pushed on. This wasn't the night for looking back. Somewhere ahead, there were houses, a handful of them, scattered along the mountainside. He didn't know which ones were occupied year-round, and which ones were summer cabins left empty and cold. He didn't know who might be awake at this hour, or who would answer a knock from a stranger in a storm like this. He didn't have the luxury of worrying about that. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, then went dead again. Jack pulled it out long enough to check the time, 12:27. The year had already turned. He slipped the phone back inside his jacket and kept walking. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Jack stopped, listening. At first, it was hard to separate from the roar of the wind. Then he heard it again. A low, steady hum. Not an engine, not quite. Something mechanical, distant but consistent. A generator. Relief came sharp and unexpected, like a punch to the chest. Jack turned slightly, angling toward the sound, and pushed on with renewed focus. The snow was deeper here, untouched by plows or passing vehicles. He lifted his knees higher with each step, legs burning, breath coming faster. The shape of a house emerged slowly from the white. A modest structure, one story, built low against the wind. Snow piled high against its walls. A single window glowed with warm yellow light, faint but unmistakable. Smoke curled from a metal chimney, bending sideways in the wind. Walt didn't hesitate. He crossed the yard, boots leaving a crooked trail behind him, and reached the front porch. The steps were half buried, slick with ice. He grabbed the railing, steadying himself, and climbed. He knocked once, hard enough to be heard over the storm. Nothing happened. He knocked again, louder this time, the sound dull against the thick door. He waited, breath heavy, heart thudding harder now from something other than exertion. Movement came from inside. A shadow passed the window. The door opened a crack, light spilling out across the porch. A woman stood there, framed by the glow. She was older, mid-70s maybe, with short gray hair pulled back into a loose bun. She wore a thick wool cardigan over a flannel shirt and heavy slippers on her feet. Her frame was small but solid, the kind built by years of work rather than exercise. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, the blue of winter skies. "Yes?" she said, voice firm but not unkind. Jack straightened as much as he could, pulling his shoulders back despite the fatigue weighing on them. Snow clung to his beard and jacket, melting slowly in the warmth spilling from the house. "My name's Jack Miller," he said. "I live down the road. I'm sorry to bother you this late." Her gaze flicked past him, taking in the storm, then returned to his face. "You picked a hell of a night to apologize," she said. "What do you need?" "I've got a dog," Jack said, wasting no time, "and 2 puppies. Found them on the road. The dog's got a fever. Power's out at my place. I need help." She studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly. Jack didn't rush it. He'd learned patience from people who knew when silence mattered. "Come inside," she said finally, stepping back and opening the door wider. "Before you freeze where you stand." Jack stepped into warmth. The house smelled of wood smoke and something herbal, clean and sharp. The entryway was small but tidy. Coats hung neatly along one wall, boots lined up by the door. A battery-powered lantern sat on a table, casting steady light. The hum Jack had heard earlier came from deeper inside. "I'm Mary Collins," the woman said, closing the door behind him. "You look like you walked out of a snowbank." "Feels like it," Jack replied. She nodded once, then gestured for him to follow. The living room was simple, worn, but cared for. A couch with a crocheted blanket draped over the back. A wooden table cluttered with papers and an old radio. A small generator sat by the back door, extension cords snaking out from it to power a lamp, and a space heater humming quietly in the corner. Mary poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove without asking. Her movements were efficient, practiced. "You said fever," she said. "How bad?" "I don't have a thermometer that works right," Jack said. "But it's high. She's exhausted. Been out in the cold too long." Mary nodded again, already moving toward a cabinet. She opened it and took out a small metal box, setting it on the table. "I used to keep dogs," she said. "My husband did, anyway. Worked search and rescue before his knees gave out. We've dealt with hypothermia and infections before." Jack felt some of the tension drain from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't know where else to go." "Storms don't leave a lot of options," Mary replied. She opened the box, revealing neatly organized supplies. Bandages, bottles with handwritten labels, a digital thermometer. She looked up at him. "How far is your place?" "About 1.5 miles," Jack said. "Down the road, past the bend." She made a thoughtful sound. "That road's bad tonight." "Yeah," Jack said. "I know." Mary handed him the thermometer and a small bottle. "This will help bring the fever down. It's mild, but it's something. You'll need to keep her warm and hydrated. No cold water. Small amounts." Jack took the items carefully, like they might break if he wasn't gentle. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. Mary snorted softly. "You can start by getting back there alive." She crossed the room and pulled a heavy coat from a hook, along with a thick scarf and an extra flashlight. She pressed them into his hands. "You're not going back out there without this," she said. "And take one of my battery heaters. It'll buy you time if the stove struggles." Jack hesitated. "You might need it." Mary met his gaze, unflinching. "I've lived on this mountain for 40 years. I know how to manage. Tonight, you need it more." He nodded, accepting the gear. At the door, he paused, turning back to her. "You didn't ask many questions," he said. Mary's expression softened, just slightly. "Some nights don't need them." Jack stepped back into the storm, better equipped, but no less exposed. The wind had not let up. Snow tore at him as he made his way down the porch and back toward the road. He kept the flashlight low, beam cutting through the white in narrow arcs. The walk back felt longer. Fatigue settled into his bones now, heavy and insistent. The cold crept in again, even through the borrowed coat. He forced himself to keep moving, counting steps, focusing on the glow of the flashlight and the image of the garage waiting ahead. Halfway back, his foot slipped on ice hidden beneath fresh snow. He caught himself hard, one knee slamming into the ground. Pain flared, sharp and bright. He sucked in a breath, gritted his teeth, and pushed himself back up. "Not tonight," he muttered. "You don't get me tonight." When the garage finally came back into view, Jack felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched so tight. The faint orange glow of the stove leaked through the cracks in the wall, steady and alive. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. Warmth wrapped around him immediately, fragile but real. The dog lifted her head at once. Jack crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her. She sniffed his coat, the new smells, then focused on his face. Her tail gave a single weak thump against the floor. "Hey," Jack said softly, "I'm back." He worked quickly but carefully, following Mary's instructions. He checked her temperature, frowned at the number, then administered the medication in small, careful doses. He adjusted the heater near her side, adding a log to the stove for good measure. She tolerated it all, eyes never leaving him. When he finally sat back, exhaustion hit him full force. He leaned against the cot, shoulders slumping, breath heavy. "You held on," he said to her. "Good job." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Inside the garage, 3 fragile lives pressed close to a small, stubborn warmth, and Jack Miller stayed with them, guarding what little he had against a night that had not finished testing him yet. The knock came just after dawn. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, deliberate, the kind that carried authority without needing to announce itself. Jack was half asleep on the concrete floor beside the cot, his back against the frame, one arm stretched out so his hand rested lightly against the dog's shoulder. He had dozed in short stretches through the night, waking every time the wind changed pitch or the stove shifted its rhythm. When the sound reached him, his eyes opened at once. For a moment, he didn't move. He listened. The storm had eased some time before sunrise. Snow still fell, but gently now, drifting instead of striking. The garage was quieter than it had been all night, the stove crackling low, steady. The puppies slept in a loose knot of fur and rags, their breathing more even than before. The dog, Roxy, he had started thinking of her by a name without realizing it, lifted her head slightly at the sound, ears angling forward. Jack eased himself to his feet, joints stiff, muscles sore from the night's work. He moved carefully, not wanting to startle her, and crossed to the door. Before opening it, he glanced back once, committing the scene to memory, warmth holding against the cold, fragile but intact. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. A man stood on the step, framed by pale morning light and fresh snow. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, built solidly rather than lean. His dark green uniform was heavy and practical, dusted with snow along the seams. A badge caught the light on his chest, dull rather than polished. His face was weathered, skin roughened by years outdoors, with short brown hair touched with gray at the temples. His eyes were calm, assessing, the kind that missed very little. "Morning," the man said. His voice was even, measured. "You Jack Miller?" Jack nodded once. "That's me." "I'm Sheriff Ben Carter," the man said, holding his badge up briefly, more habit than necessity. "Mind if I come in?" Jack hesitated for half a second. Then he stepped aside. "Go ahead." The sheriff stepped into the garage, stamping snow from his boots. His gaze moved slowly around the space, tools, cot, stove, before settling on the dog and her puppies. He didn't react right away. He took in details, posture relaxed but alert. "Got a call early this morning," Carter said. "Neighbor up the road said she saw you out walking in the storm last night. Said you looked like you were in trouble." Jack exhaled softly. "I was. Still am, depending how you look at it." Carter nodded, then crouched a few feet from the dog, keeping his distance. Roxy watched him closely, her body tensing slightly, but she didn't move toward him. Jack noticed that her feverish panting had eased. That mattered. "She yours?" Carter asked. Jack shook his head. "No, sir. Found her and the pups on the road last night. They wouldn't have made it another hour." Carter studied the puppies, eyes narrowing slightly. "You got papers?" "No," Jack said. "Didn't exactly have time to ask." A hint of something crossed the sheriff's face. Sympathy, maybe, tempered by habit. He straightened and turned to Jack. "Problem is," Carter said carefully, "we've had reports lately. Abandoned dogs near the protected zones. Some folks out here have been breeding shepherds with wild stock. Creates problems. Dangerous ones." Jack felt his jaw tighten. "They're not wild." "I'm not saying they are," Carter replied evenly. "I'm saying I have to check." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. Jack watched the movement, a familiar weight settling in his chest. He'd known this was coming, even in the middle of the night. Rules always showed up eventually. "You understand my position?" Carter continued. "Unregistered animals, no ownership documentation. By procedure, I'm supposed to take them in for evaluation." Roxy shifted then, a low sound rumbling in her chest. Not a growl exactly, but close enough to carry warning. Carter noticed, raising one hand slowly, palm open. "It's all right," he said. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." Jack stepped forward, placing himself between the sheriff and the dog without thinking. His stance was calm, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the intent behind it. "She's sick," Jack said. "She's got a fever. If you move her now—" "I won't," Carter interrupted. "Not like this. I'm not heartless." He paused, studying Jack more closely now. The worn jacket hanging on a hook. The bruised knuckles. The exhaustion written plainly across his face. "You a vet?" Carter asked. "No." "Got any training?" Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "Not the kind you mean." Carter closed his notebook slowly. "All right," he said. "Here's what I can do. I'll file this as a rescue in progress. I'll give you time to get her stabilized, but I need proof. Something to show she's domestic. Vet records. A microchip scan. Something." "How much time?" Jack asked. Carter met his gaze. 72 hours. Jack exhaled, shoulders loosening just a fraction. I can do that. I hope so, Carter said, because after that, if I don't have paperwork, I won't have much choice. He glanced at the dog again, then back at Jack. You care about them. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked down at Roxy, at the way she watched him, the puppies, the stranger in the room. He thought of the road, the storm, the weight of her body shaking under his hands. Yeah, he said finally, I do. Carter nodded once. That helps. He turned toward the door, then paused. Couple more things, he added. I'll have animal control on standby, not coming out unless I call them. And I'll check back in tomorrow, weather permitting. Jack nodded. Fair. The sheriff stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The garage felt quieter without him, the space settling back into itself. Jack stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. Then he let out a slow breath and crouched beside Roxy again. It's all right, he said softly. He's gone. She watched him for a second longer, then lowered her head, tension easing from her shoulders. One of the puppies stirred, letting out a small sound. Jack adjusted the rags and checked the heater, then sank back down beside them. His legs trembled with delayed fatigue. He leaned his head back against the cot, eyes closing briefly. Rules. He'd spent most of his life living under them. Some had kept people alive. Others had done nothing but make things harder. Out here, on a mountain road in the middle of winter, rules felt like a distant language spoken by people who'd never felt this kind of cold. He opened his eyes and looked at Roxy again. We've got 3 days, he said. I'll figure something out. Outside, the clouds shifted, letting a thin wash of pale sunlight spill across the snow. The storm had passed, but the test hadn't. Not yet. Jack reached out and rested his hand against Roxy's shoulder. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, her weight warm and real. For now, that was enough. The exhaustion did not hit Jack all at once. It crept in quietly, the way cold did when you stopped paying attention to it. First came the heaviness in his limbs, the dull ache in his shoulders and lower back that he had learned to ignore over years of physical work. Then the slower reactions, the way his hand hesitated before reaching for the kettle, the way his thoughts took an extra second to line up before turning into action. He told himself it was nothing. He had told himself that before, plenty of times. By late afternoon, the light outside the garage had taken on that washed-out winter look, pale and brittle, as if it might snap if you pressed too hard against it. Snow still lay thick across the ground, but the wind had calmed. The mountain felt like it was holding its breath. Jack had been moving non-stop since the sheriff left. He cleaned and rewrapped the cut on Roxy's leg. He fed the stove. He melted snow for water and warmed it slowly. He checked the puppies again and again, counting breaths, watching their tiny chests rise and fall. He barely noticed how little he had eaten until his stomach cramped sharply, reminding him that coffee and adrenaline were not substitutes for food. He waved it off and kept going. Roxy lay on her side near the stove now, her breathing steadier than it had been in the night, but still labored. The fever hadn't broken. Jack pressed the back of his hand to her neck again and frowned. She lifted her head at his touch, eyes tracking him with quiet intensity. I know, he murmured. I'm trying. He stood and crossed to the workbench, reaching for the kettle. The room tilted slightly as he did. It wasn't much, just a brief shift, but it was enough to make him pause. He planted his feet and waited for the sensation to pass. It didn't. Instead, the dizziness rolled deeper, heavy and insistent. His vision dimmed at the edges. He felt suddenly, acutely cold, as if the heat from the stove had vanished without warning. His fingers slipped on the handle of the kettle, metal clanging softly against the bench. Jack swore under his breath and leaned forward, bracing himself with both hands. Not now, he muttered. You don't get to do this now. His body disagreed. The long night, the cold exposure, the miles walked through the storm, all of it came due at once. His legs weakened, the strength draining out of them like water from a cracked container. He tried to straighten, to take a step back toward the cot, but his knees buckled before he could move. He went down hard. The impact rattled through him, sharp and jarring. He caught himself on one forearm, but not before his shoulder slammed into the concrete. Pain flared, bright and immediate, then dulled into something deeper. He lay there, breathing hard, the world narrowed to the rough gray floor beneath his cheek. For a moment, he couldn't move. The sound that reached him next cut through the fog in his head. It was not loud, not aggressive. It was a low, urgent sound drawn from deep in the chest, vibrating with intent. Roxy. Jack forced his eyes open and turned his head slightly. She had pushed herself upright, trembling with the effort. Her legs shook violently beneath her weight, but she stayed standing, ears forward, gaze locked on him. When he didn't move, she took a step toward him. "No," Jack rasped. "Stay. You need to stay down." She ignored him. She crossed the distance between them slowly, carefully, favoring her injured leg. When she reached him, she lowered her head and nudged his shoulder with her muzzle. The touch was firm, insistent. When he still didn't respond, she nudged him again, harder this time. Jack groaned, trying to push himself up. His arms trembled uselessly beneath him. "All right," he breathed. "All right." Roxy shifted position, pressing her body against his side, using her weight to keep him from rolling onto his back. Then she did something Jack would remember for the rest of his life. She lifted her head and let out a long, steady call. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a howl. It was something in between, a sustained sound, low and carrying, pitched just right to travel through walls and across distance. She paused, drew breath, and did it again. The sound echoed faintly off the metal walls of the garage and slipped out through the cracks into the cold afternoon air. Jack lay there, stunned, listening. "Roxy," he whispered, the name finally leaving his mouth out loud. "Easy." She didn't stop. She moved closer to the door, bracing herself, and called again. Her voice wavered slightly with effort, but the intent behind it was clear. This was not fear. This was purpose. Jack felt something twist in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time blurred. He tried again to move, to sit up, but his head swam violently, forcing him to stop. His breath came shallow and fast now, chest tight. The cold had crept back in, clinging to his skin from the concrete floor. Roxy returned to his side and pressed her head against his chest, warmth seeping through layers of fabric. She stayed there, breathing against him, grounding him, her presence steady and unyielding. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. The knock on the door startled him awake. It was louder this time, urgent. "Jack?" a voice called from outside. "Jack Miller, you in there?" Mary Collins. Relief washed through him, dizzying in its intensity. "I'm here," he croaked, forcing the words out. "Doors open." The handle rattled, then the door swung wide. Cold air rushed in, followed immediately by Mary, bundled in a heavy coat, her gray hair tucked under a wool hat. Her eyes took in the scene in an instant. Jack on the floor. Roxy pressed against him, the puppies stirring faintly on the cot. "Oh," she said, and crossed the room in 3 quick steps. She knelt beside Jack, her movements calm and precise. "Don't try to get up," she said firmly. "Just stay with me." "I'm fine," Jack said automatically. Mary snorted. "You're horizontal on a concrete floor in a freezing garage. That's not fine." She checked his pulse, then pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. "You're cold and you're exhausted," she said. "Likely borderline hypothermia. Sit still." She looked over at Roxy and softened slightly. "Good girl," she murmured. "You did exactly right." Roxy watched her closely, but didn't move away. Her tail gave a single, weak wag against the floor. Mary moved quickly, efficiently. She grabbed the battery heater she'd lent Jack the night before and repositioned it closer. She layered blankets over Jack's legs and torso, careful not to smother him. She pressed a warm mug into his hands once he could sit up with her help. "Drink," she ordered. Slowly. Jack obeyed, the warmth seeping into his fingers and chest, chasing the cold, back inch by inch. His head cleared gradually, the dizziness easing. "I heard her," Mary said quietly, glancing at Roxy. "From my place." That call of hers cut right through the air. Jack looked at the dog, still pressed against his side. "She wouldn't let me pass out," he said hoarsely. "Wouldn't let me go." Mary nodded. "That's a shepherd for you. They don't leave their people." Jack swallowed hard, emotion rising unexpectedly in his throat. "I wasn't her people," he said. Mary met his gaze. "You are now." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the stove, the heater, and the quiet breathing of dogs and humans sharing the same fragile space. When Jack finally felt steady enough to sit on the cot, Mary turned her attention back to Roxy. She checked her temperature again, frowned slightly, then nodded. "She's holding," Mary said. "Fever hasn't spiked. That's good." Roxy lowered herself carefully onto the floor again, exhaustion reclaiming its hold. One of the puppies stirred and crawled closer to her belly, instinct guiding it even in sleep. Jack watched the scene with a strange hollow ache in his chest. She saved me, he said quietly. Mary smiled, small and knowing. Seems like you've been saving each other. Outside, the light began to fade again, the brief winter day already drawing to a close. The storm clouds were gone, leaving behind a sky pale and indifferent. Snow glittered faintly where the sun caught it. Inside the garage, Jack leaned back against the cot, wrapped in borrowed blankets, Roxy resting nearby. For the first time since the night began, he allowed himself to rest, not because he wanted to, but because someone else had insisted on it. He closed his eyes, hand resting against the warm curve of Roxy's shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured, not sure who he was saying it to anymore. Roxy's tail thumped once against the floor. The nights came earlier after the storm. Snow still covered the mountain like a second skin, but the air had shifted. The sharp violence of the wind was gone, replaced by a quieter cold that settled into bones and stayed there. Days shortened to thin bands of pale light, and by late afternoon the shadows stretched long across the road, pooling between trees and buildings. Jack noticed the change in himself before he noticed it in the weather. He moved slower now, not out of weakness, but caution. His shoulder still ached from the fall, a deep soreness that reminded him when he reached too far or lifted too quickly. Mary stopped by once a day, sometimes twice, bringing soup, checking Roxy's temperature, scolding Jack gently for pushing himself too hard. He listened more than he argued. That alone marked a difference. The garage had taken on a different rhythm. The stove burned more steadily now. Tools were returned to their places instead of left where they fell. The cot stayed made. It wasn't cleanliness exactly, but intention. Jack found himself waking before dawn, feeding the fire, checking on Roxy and the puppies before anything else. The puppies, Buddy and Luna, names that had settled naturally, were stronger now, their movements clumsy but determined. They wrestled in short bursts, then collapsed in a tangled heap, breath coming fast and content. Roxy watched them constantly. She still moved carefully, her injured leg healing but not yet whole. The fever had broken 2 days after Jack's collapse, leaving her thinner, quieter, but alert. She positioned herself between the puppies and the door without thinking, her body angled to block the opening, her eyes tracking every sound from outside. Jack noticed that too. The first time it mattered, he almost missed it. It was just after dusk. The sky had turned that flat gray that came before night, and the temperature dropped fast. Jack was at the workbench sorting bolts into coffee cans when Roxy's head lifted sharply. Her ears came forward, body stiffening. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. She stood. Jack froze, listening. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, the crunch of footsteps on snow. Slow, careful. Not the heavy tread of someone passing by on the road. Closer, intentional. Jack straightened and moved toward the door, hand resting on the frame. He didn't open it. He simply waited. The footsteps stopped. There was a pause. Then a soft sound. Metal scraping lightly against metal near the side of the garage. Jack's jaw tightened. He glanced at Roxy. She had moved closer to the door now, standing squarely in front of it, tail low, body solid. When Jack shifted his weight, she glanced back at him briefly, then returned her attention forward. "Stay," Jack said quietly. She didn't move. Jack reached for the light switch out of habit, then stopped. The garage stayed dim, lit only by the stove's glow. He took a breath and spoke, his voice carrying, just enough to be heard through the door. "Whatever you're looking for," he said evenly, "it's not here." Silence answered him. Then Roxy made a sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was a low, steady warning drawn from deep in her chest, vibrating through the room. Not fear, not anger, presence. The metal scraping stopped. Footsteps retreated, faster this time, crunching away into the snow. Jack waited a full minute after the sound faded before moving. Only then did he cross to the door and check the latch. It was intact. No damage. No sign of forced entry. He turned back to Roxy. She stood where she was, still watching the door, muscles tense. When Jack approached, she finally relaxed, lowering herself slowly to the floor. Her tail thumped once against the concrete. "Good girl," Jack said softly. The words felt right. Word spread faster than Jack expected. In a town like Silver Ridge, things always did. Mary mentioned it first, casual, as if it were nothing. "Sheriff Carter stopped by this morning," she said, setting a container of stew on the bench. "Said someone was snooping around the outbuildings near the highway last night. Asked if I'd heard anything." Jack raised an eyebrow. You tell him? I told him you had a dog with a voice loud enough to wake the dead, Mary replied dryly, and that anyone with sense would leave you alone. Jack huffed a quiet laugh. The next day, a man from the hardware store stopped by with a box of scrap wood. Figured you could use it for the stove, he said, shifting awkwardly on his feet. Heard you took in a shepherd. Those dogs don't miss much. Jack accepted the wood with a nod. Thanks. By the end of the week, people began leaving things by the garage. An old generator that still worked if you kicked it just right, a sack of dog food, a pair of thick work gloves, barely used. No notes, no explanations. Jack didn't ask. He didn't need to. Roxy became a fixture in the neighborhood without ever leaving the garage. People slowed when they passed, glancing toward the open door, reassured by the solid shape lying just inside. At night, Jack left the door cracked when weather allowed, letting sound carry. He slept better knowing Roxy was there, her breathing a steady counterpoint to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside, Jack sat on the cot, boots off, shoulder wrapped loosely in a bandage Mary insisted on changing daily. Buddy and Luna tumbled across his legs, gnawing on his pant cuff. Roxy lay nearby, head on her paws, eyes half closed. You know, Jack said quietly, mostly to himself, you didn't have to do any of this. Roxy opened one eye. I stopped because of you, he continued. On that road. I could have kept going. Her eye closed again, as if the thought didn't interest her. Jack leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, earned. Later that night, a truck pulled up outside. Jack heard it before he saw it, the low hum of tires on snow-packed ground. Roxy was on her feet instantly, alert but calm. Jack stood and opened the door. Sheriff Carter stood outside, hands tucked into his coat, breath fogging the air. Evening, he said. Evening, Jack replied. Carter glanced past him, taking in the scene, the puppies, Roxy, the order of the space. I came to check in, he said, see how things were going. Jack nodded. She's improving, puppies too. Carter smiled faintly. I can see that. He shifted his weight. Word is, you scared off a trespasser the other night. Jack shrugged. Didn't scare anyone, just didn't open the door. Carter's gaze settled on Roxy. She helped. Yeah, Jack said. She did. Carter cleared his throat. I also wanted to let you know, there's a position opening up. Night watch at the equipment yard near the pass. Not glamorous, but it's steady work, and it wouldn't hurt to have a dog like that around. Jack looked at him, surprised. I thought you were here about paperwork. Carter smiled slightly. That too, and I haven't forgotten. But sometimes things work themselves out. He paused. You interested? Jack glanced at Roxy. She watched him calmly, tail resting still against the floor. Yeah, Jack said. I think I am. After the sheriff left, Jack closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, breathing slowly. The weight in his chest felt different now, not gone, just shifted. Roxy crossed the room and pressed her side against his leg, solid and warm. You did that, Jack said softly. You know that? Her tail thumped once. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and steady. Inside the garage, Jack sat back down on the cot, puppies climbing into his lap, Roxy settling at his feet. The night passed without incident, watched over by something stronger than locks or rules. Some things didn't need to be loud to be powerful. They just needed to stand their ground. Winter loosened its grip slowly in Silver Ridge. It didn't announce itself with sunshine or sudden warmth. It arrived in small, almost apologetic ways. The way the snow softened at the edges, the way the road showed through in thin gray lines by midday, the way the wind lost some of its teeth. The mountains stayed quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the holding of breath, more like a long exhale. Jack noticed it first in the mornings. He rose before dawn, the habit fixed into him as deep as bone. The stove was easier to start now, the fire catching quicker, the wood less stubborn. He brewed coffee on the small burner and drank it standing by the open door, watching the pale light creep across the snow. Roxy lay just inside the threshold, her body stretched along the concrete, ears turning toward every sound. Buddy and Luna slept curled against her belly, growing heavier by the day. They were no longer fragile. The puppies moved with confidence now, wobbling less, tumbling more. Buddy had discovered his bark, short, sharp, and startling for something so small. Luna followed him everywhere, quieter but no less determined. They learned the shape of the garage quickly, the boundaries of warmth and shadow, the places Jack allowed and the ones he didn't. Roxy corrected them gently, a nudge here, a low sound there, never harsh, always certain. Jack watched it all with a kind of calm he hadn't felt in years. Sheriff Carter came by again 2 days later, this time without the weight of urgency hanging in the air. He stood with Jack by the workbench while Mary fussed over the puppies, her approval clear in the way she hummed under her breath. "They're doing well," Carter said, glancing toward Roxy. "All three," Jack nodded. "They are." Carter pulled a small scanner from his pocket and crouched, moving slowly so as not to startle anyone. Roxy watched him, but didn't interfere. The device beeped once, then again. "Well, I'll be," Carter said. "She's chipped." He read off the number, then straightened. "Registered out of state. Family moved years ago. Never updated the info." Jack felt something ease in his chest. "So, she's domestic," he said. "Very much so," Carter replied. "Paperwork will take a few days, but this helps, a lot." Mary smiled, satisfied. "Told you she wasn't wild," she said. Carter chuckled. "Never doubted it. Just had to be sure." He tucked the scanner away and shifted his weight. "About that job I mentioned." Jack leaned back against the bench, arms crossed loosely. "Yeah? Night watch position's yours if you want it," Carter said. "Equipment yard near the pass. Quiet most nights, decent pay, and they're fine with you bringing a dog." Jack glanced at Roxy, who lay with her head on her paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. "I'll take it," Jack said. Carter nodded. "Thought you might." The first night Jack reported for work, the air was clear and cold, the sky sharp with stars. The equipment yard sat just off the highway, fenced and orderly, machines lined up like patient animals at rest. Jack walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching softly on gravel. Roxy moved at his side, her gait steady now, leg fully healed. She paused often, listening, reading the dark in ways Jack had learned to trust. Nothing happened. That was the point. Word traveled, as it always did. People passing through slowed when they saw Jack and the shepherd walking the fence line. A few nodded, some waved. One man stopped to ask if Jack could keep an eye on his truck overnight, just until morning. Jack agreed. Then another asked the same. Soon, it wasn't unusual to see 2 or 3 vehicles parked near the yard, their owners reassured by the quiet presence moving through the dark. Roxy never barked. She didn't need to. Back at the garage, life settled into a rhythm. Mary came by on Sundays now, bringing bread or stew, sitting on an overturned crate while Jack fixed small things around the place. She told stories without drama, about her husband, about the mountain before the road was paved, about winters that lasted longer than anyone expected. Jack listened. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't. Both felt fine. One afternoon, as the snow melted enough to reveal patches of earth beneath, Jack found an old wooden sign behind the garage, warped and forgotten. He sanded it down, straightened the edges, and painted it a simple, clean white. When it dried, he carved letters into it by hand, slow and careful. Miller's Garage and Night Watch, keeping an eye on things. He hung it beside the door, stepping back to study it. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. Roxy sat nearby, head tilted slightly, as if considering the work. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "That'll do." The night Mary noticed him smiling was the night he didn't realize he was doing it. They sat by the stove, the garage door cracked, opened to let in the sound of melting snow dripping from the roof. Buddy and Luna chased each other in uneven circles, tripping over their own paws. Roxy watched them, patient and calm. "You look different," Mary said suddenly. Jack glanced up. "Different how?" "Lighter," she replied, "like you put something down." Jack considered that. He looked around the garage, the stove, the tools, the dogs. He thought of the road, the storm, the weight of Roxy's body leaning against his leg when he needed it most. "Maybe," he said. Spring came quietly, the way winter had left. The creek near the road began to run again, dark water cutting through ice. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Jack started leaving the door open during the day, letting sunlight spill across the concrete floor. One morning, as he stepped outside with his coffee, Roxy followed him, Buddy and Luna tumbling after her. They stood together at the edge of the drive, looking out at the mountain. Jack rested his hands on his hips and breathed. "You know," he said, "I didn't plan on any of this." Roxy glanced up at him. Guess that's how it goes, he added. Later that week, Sheriff Carter stopped B one last time, paperwork in hand. Jack signed where he was told, the pen scratching across the page. Carter handed him a copy and extended his hand. Looks like everything's official, he said. She's yours now, all three of them. Jack shook his hand, firm and steady. Thank you. Carter nodded toward Roxy. I think she picked you first. After he left, Jack sat on the cot, papers folded neatly beside him. Roxy approached and pressed her head against his knee, solid and familiar. Buddy and Luna climbed into his lap, tails wagging wildly. Yeah, Jack said softly, resting his hand on Roxy's neck. I think you did. That night, the sky cleared completely. Stars burned bright above the mountain, sharp and endless. Jack walked the fence line at the equipment yard, Roxy moving beside him, the puppies staying back in the garage with Mary for the evening. The cold was still there, but it didn't feel hostile anymore, just honest. When Jack returned home, he found the garage warm and lit, Mary waiting with tea. Roxy settled near the door, eyes half closed, content. Jack sat down on the cot, boots off, and leaned back against the wall. He listened to the quiet, the fire, the breathing, the soft sounds of life continuing. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was standing watch against the world. He felt like he belonged to something. Roxy lifted her head and looked at him, her gaze steady and calm. Yeah, Jack murmured. Me too. Outside, the mountain stood silent under the stars, holding its secrets, its storms, its second chances. Inside the small garage at the edge of Silver Ridge, a man and his dogs rested together, warm and unafraid, ready to meet whatever came next. Together. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles as thunder or light. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through a freezing night, a tired man, and a dog who refuses to give up. If you're walking through a storm in your own life, remember this: you are not forgotten. Grace often arrives in the smallest acts of love. If this story gave you hope, share it with someone who needs it today. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you, protect you, and guide your path wherever you are.